On August the 29th, 2005, New Orleans underwent a profound transformation that would leave an indelible mark on its history. The tragedy struck particularly hard at the heart of the city, the Ninth Ward, a community deeply rooted in the struggles against redlining and segregation policies that sought to confine its residents. As we reflect upon the events of 2005, we recognize that it's been 18 years since Hurricane Katrina unleashed its devastating force, forever altering the lives and landscapes of New Orleans. In the days preceding the catastrophic arrival of Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans mayor proclaimed a state of emergency. However, it was not until the eve of the hurricane's onslaught that he issued a mandatory evacuation. Tragically, roughly 100,000 residents found themselves without a viable means of transportation. The Black community in New Orleans had long grappled with economic disparities as they lagged behind their white counterparts even before the advent of Katrina. Their plight worsened when what began as a formidable Category 3 storm rapidly intensified into an unprecedented Category 5 storm upon landfall on August the 29th. This merciless force overwhelmed levees and floodwalls, triggering breaches that unleashed thousands of gallons of water up to 10 feet deep, inundating the lower Ninth Ward and submerging approximately 80% of the city. What unfolded afterwards was an unforgettable, harrowing sequence of events, an unforgivable chain reaction that forever scarred both individuals and communities alike. For those who didn't know, the Ninth Ward in New Orleans is surrounded by water on three sides: the Mississippi River to the south, the Bayou Bienvenue to the east, and the Industrial Canal to the west. This geographical placement rendered the Ninth Ward vulnerable to some of the most catastrophic flooding experienced during Hurricane Katrina's onslaught. Despite half of New Orleans residing above sea level, its average elevation languished 6 feet below. Throughout history, levees and floodwalls have safeguarded against encroaching waters. However, these protective barriers proved feeble before Katrina's unyielding might. The aftermath of Katrina unleashed a devastating impact that left countless residents stranded with no immediate rescue and assistance. This dire situation was particularly pronounced in impoverished neighborhoods where the glaring absence of effective government planning and response efforts became painfully apparent. Iconic photographs immortalized the plight faced by those seeking refuge amidst floodwaters, perched atop roofs, clinging to cars, navigating treacherous paths in search of safe shelter. Those images predominantly captured the struggles endured by Black individuals who bore a disproportionate burden from this tragedy. Many sought refuge at facilities like the Superdome Stadium, where access to basic necessities such as food, clean water, and medical care for severely injured survivors remained limited. Regrettably, even the sanctuary of the Superdome itself succumbed to the relentless fury of Katrina's winds exceeding 100 miles per hour, an onslaught that damaged its roof after more than 10,000 people had sought solace within its walls. For 5 hot, humid, and unbearable days, it was a makeshift haven to 30,000 desperate people who were at risk of contracting waterborne diseases. Children suffered from malnutrition. Those injured had no medical care. For many, they were permanently displaced. Private security contractor firm Blackwater USA hired mercenaries who were tasked with protecting white elites rather than prioritizing aid distribution or assisting vulnerable communities disproportionately impacted by the storm's aftermath. The men from Blackwater USA arrived in New Orleans right after Katrina hit. The company, known for its private security work guarding senior U.S. diplomats, beat the federal government and most aid organizations to the scene. About 150 heavily armed Blackwater troops, dressed in full battle gear, spread out into the chaos of New Orleans. Some patrolled the streets in SUVs with tinted windows and the Blackwater logo splashed on the back. Others sped around the French Quarter in an unmarked car with no license plate. 3 days after Hurricane Katrina struck, thousands of survivors in New Orleans said they started to walk across the bridge to the city of Gretna to escape the flooding and chaos, but were met by a line of armed Gretna police who blocked the primary road and bridge that connected the city of Gretna to New Orleans. They were turned away, and shots were fired over their heads. In the Superdome, conditions rapidly deteriorated from bad to worse. It took weeks for water to recede, and rescue and recovery efforts were slow. By September the 1st, the number of occupants in the shelter had grown to over 30,000, with an additional 25,000 at the city's convention center. Those stuck in the crowded shelters spent time looking for missing family members and friends. The Bush administration initially rejected foreign aid offer as the Hurricane Katrina situation deteriorated. Allies offered $850 million in cash and in oil that was to be sold, but only $40 million had been used for disaster victims or reconstruction, according to U.S. officials and contractors. Most of the aid went uncollected, including the $400 million worth of oil. White vigilante groups barricaded roads and violently turned away black evacuees trying to flee the city. They patrolled the streets of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, shooting at least 11 black American men. Local police didn't conduct an investigation into the shootings until a year later. In a frontline interview, Donnell Harrington described being shot when he, his cousin, and a friend were fleeing his damaged home, headed to a designated evacuation zone, a ferry terminal on the river. As the water rose in prison buildings, deputies deserted en masse, leaving behind prisoners in locked cells. The prisoners spent days without power, food, or water, some standing in sewage-tainted water up to their chests and neck. Some prisoners claimed that deputies forced them into their cells by shooting beanbag, macing, and tasing them. Once they returned to their cells, some deputies handcuffed the cell doors to prevent them from escaping. As the locked cells began to flood, prisoners hung signs out of the broken windows for help, and others jumped into the water below. According to the testimonials, deputies and members of the Prison Special Investigation Division shot at some of the prisoners who were attempting to escape the rising water inside the jail, and several prisoners report that they witnessed fellow prisoners getting shot in the back. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, a series of devastating events unfolded. Displacement, loss of life, racial inequalities, and inadequate government assistance compounded the hardship faced by affected communities. Amidst this tumultuous landscape, another disheartening revelation emerged. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention withheld critical information regarding toxic formaldehyde levels found in FEMA trailers that were provided as temporary housing for thousands of displaced residents. In early 2006, occupants began experiencing health issues such as respiratory problems and nosebleeds, a distressing development that raised concern about their living conditions. The CDC initiated testing on these trailers in 2006 and uncovered alarming concentrations of formaldehyde. Regrettably, they chose not to publicly disclose their findings or issue warnings until 2008, a significant delay that left residents unknowingly exposed to heightened risks. Hurricane Katrina represented an overview of how systemic racism and discriminatory policies compounded disaster impacts for Black New Orleanians. Katrina and its aftermath exposed the underlying truth about New Orleans' social fabric, which was a city starkly divided between those who had resources and means to evacuate safely beforehand and those who did not. This divide was clearly visible in the aftermath of the hurricane. The neglectful government's response heightened the systemic inequalities deeply rooted in racial disparity and socioeconomic factors that persisted long before Hurricane Katrina struck. The lasting impact of Hurricane Katrina serves as a reminder of the resilience displayed by Black people, especially in New Orleans, and their struggle for survival amidst unimaginable hardships. It also calls for greater attention towards addressing structural inequalities within America to ensure that communities, especially Black communities, are never again left vulnerable during times of crisis.